My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and until that Thursday evening, I believed the digital security on my studio and the locks on my doors were enough to keep my parents out of my life. I was wrong. As I pulled up to my office building, I saw their black SUV at the curb. They did not wave or get out. They waited until I noticed the eviction notice pasted on my glass door, then drove away. A white envelope had been slid beneath the door gap with 4 words in my mother's handwriting. Do not make a scene. I should have left it untouched, but the warning felt like another command from childhood. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing I saw was that my main servers holding months of architectural designs were gone. The second was a thick envelope stamped with the name of a high-profile family court attorney. My knees nearly gave out. I dialed my husband before reading another page. He arrived within minutes, stopped at the sight of the empty server racks, looked at the open envelope and turned pale. "Please do not tell me," he whispered. "They actually did it." His words frightened me more than the empty room because they meant he knew something I did not. Before I tell you what my husband found beneath those legal papers and why a missing server was just the beginning of a $45 million trap, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you listening from? And what is the weather like there? I am curious to see how far this story will travel. David gently took the heavy envelope from my shaking hands. He pulled out the stack of legal documents, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. The silence in my empty studio was deafening. The racks where my computer servers used to hum were completely bare, stripped of every wire and hard drive, but the missing hardware suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. The papers in David's hands were not about intellectual property or breaking my commercial lease. They were about Theo. Our son was 7 years old. He was a bright, curious boy who loved building block towers and watching the rain. He also had a very mild, easily managed case of childhood asthma. As David read the petition aloud, my blood ran cold. The document was an emergency request for full guardianship. It did not sound like it was written about my life. It was a masterpiece of fiction. According to the sworn statements filed by Jevin and Cynthia, I was a neglectful, obsessive workaholic who repeatedly ignored my son's medical needs. They claimed my independent architectural practice had driven me into a state of severe mental instability. They painted Theo's mild asthma as a life-threatening condition that I was actively ignoring. They stated that my home was an unsafe environment and that as wealthy and established real estate developers, they were the only ones capable of providing a stable, high-class foundation for their grandson. They were using the legal system to steal my child. I stood in the center of the room. A normal person might have screamed. A normal daughter might have collapsed on the floor crying, begging the universe to explain why her own flesh and blood would do something so unbelievably cruel. But I did not cry. Crying was exactly what Cynthia wanted. She thrived on my tears. She fed on my emotional breakdowns because they proved her narrative that I was weak. Instead of panic, a strange, absolute stillness settled over my mind. I looked at the thick stack of lies. I looked at the empty spaces where my life's work had been. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought taking my son and my business simultaneously would force a total surrender. I took a slow, deep breath, steadying my heart rate. I walked over to the corner of the room where a small backup monitor sat on a secondary desk. The screen was dark, but a tiny green light blinked steadily in the corner. I leaned in closer. It was a diagnostic tool David had installed for me months ago. The light meant there was an active incoming data ping. My servers were not in a police lockup. They were connected to a network. David followed my gaze. As a senior software engineer, he understood exactly what that blinking green light meant before I even had to ask. He immediately pulled his laptop from his messenger bag, connected it to the secondary port, and began running a trace on the network logs. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of the screen. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of keys. Finally, he stopped. He looked up at me, his expression caught between utter disbelief and absolute disgust. The servers had not been seized by a legitimate property management company for an eviction. They had been physically removed and instantly reconnected to a private high-speed network. David traced the IP address directly back to a corporate server farm in downtown Chicago. It was the exact address of Jevin and Cynthia's real estate empire. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This was never just about a sudden, overwhelming concern for their grandson's respiratory health. It was about greed. For the past 8 months, I had poured every ounce of my talent into designing an innovative, fully sustainable eco-resort. It was a massive undertaking, a revolutionary blueprint blending green technology with luxury hospitality. The bidding for the development rights was closing in less than a week, and the investor package was worth $45 million. I knew for a fact that Jevon's firm was failing. His traditional concrete-heavy designs were being rejected by modern investors. His public image as a visionary was crumbling. He was desperate. He needed a groundbreaking project to secure that $45 million funding, and he knew my eco-resort was perfect. But Jevon was too arrogant to hire me, and too proud to ask for my help, so he orchestrated a hostile takeover of my life. By buying my building through a shell company and faking an eviction, he stole my master computer files. By filing a fake emergency custody order for Theo, he was holding my heart hostage. He calculated that a terrified promisade, bankrupt mother, facing the loss of her child, would never have the resources or the mental bandwidth to fight a corporate intellectual property theft. He thought he had engineered the perfect crime. He thought I was powerless. I looked at David, my voice completely level. I told him to pack up the backup laptop, let them mirror the drives, let them look at the beautiful $45 million blueprints. 24 hours later, the phone on my kitchen counter rang. The caller identification displayed Jevon's private internal office number. I let the phone ring 3 times. I wanted to establish the pacing. I reached over, tapped the speakerphone button, and simultaneously hit the record icon on my secondary device. In the state of Illinois, recording a conversation requires 2-party consent, but I did not care about using this in a courtroom. I cared about capturing the exact tone of his arrogance for my own clarity. "Hello, Jevon," I said. "Vanessa," his voice came through the speaker. It was smooth, polished, and entirely devoid of guilt. It was the exact tone he used when closing hostile acquisitions. "I am glad you answered. I assume you have read the documents." "I have," I replied calmly. He sighed a perfectly practiced sound of paternal disappointment. "We do not want to ruin your career, Vanessa. We are simply restructuring your priorities. A mother should not be playing with useless, independent drawings when her son needs a prestigious foundation and proper medical supervision. You are clearly overwhelmed." He paused, letting the weight of the fake custody battle hang in the air. "Here is what we are going to do," he continued. "You will sign the custody addendum, allowing Cynthia and me to make all primary educational and medical decisions for Theo. In exchange, we will drop the emergency hearing. Furthermore, I see you have locked the master computer files with an encrypted password. You will provide that password today. If you do, I will graciously allow you to retain a junior assistant credit on the eco-resort project when my firm pitches it next week." It was an absurd ultimatum. He was stealing my child, stealing my $45 million design, and offering me a desk in the corner of his office as a consolation prize. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cry, to hurl insults, to threaten him with police. But anger is a loud, messy emotion, and I had no room for a mess. "Jevon," I said softly. My voice did not shake. My breathing did not hitch. I leaned closer to the microphone. "You do not need a password. You can go ahead and open the file." There was a brief silence on the line. He was confused by my compliance, perhaps suspecting I had finally broken under the pressure. "Excellent," he said, his ego instantly recovering. "You are finally thinking like an adult. We will send the papers over this afternoon." He disconnected the call. The dial tone echoed in the quiet kitchen. I looked across the marble island at David. His hands were resting on his laptop keyboard, waiting for my signal. "Begin the sequence," I told him. "Start the Trojan. To understand why Jevon and Cynthia wanted control over Theo, you have to understand the mechanics of a narcissistic empire. They did not want to raise my son. They did not want to read him bedtime stories or sit on the floor building block towers. They wanted a trophy. Growing up, I was never a daughter. I was a highly curated exhibit. I vividly remember being 8 years old, standing in the grand foyer of a country club. Cynthia had forced me into a stiff, scratchy velvet dress that dug into my ribs. I was instructed to stand perfectly still, hold a polite smile, and speak only when addressed by the wealthy investors Jevon was trying to court. If my posture slumped, or if I looked too tired, Cynthia would walk past me and subtly, viciously pinch the back of my arm. Smile, she would hiss through her teeth. "You represent this family. They used me to project an image of the perfect, wholesome, stable American family. It was a marketing tactic, but as I grew older and developed my own mind, I stopped being a compliant prop. I chose architecture over their real estate sales business. I chose a quiet life with David over their high society galas. I stripped them of their favorite accessory. Now, decades later, Jevon's firm was losing ground. Their public relations team was desperate for a rebrand, a way to soften their ruthless corporate image. And what better way to do that than by parading a charming, well-dressed 7-year-old grandson in front of the cameras? They wanted to put Theo in a tiny, tailored suit. They wanted to use his mild asthma to play the role of the benevolent, heroic grandparents stepping in to save a vulnerable child. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They normalized their cruelty by wrapping it in the language of love and concern. If you stay in their orbit long enough, you start to believe that their control is just a form of protection. You learn to stay helpless. But that illusion had shattered for me the night before the servers were stolen. I was tucking Theo into bed, pulling his favorite quilt up to his chin. He looked at me, his large eyes serious in the dim light. "Mommy," he whispered softly. Today at school during recess, Grandpa stood outside the chain-link fence. He did not wave. He just stood by his black car and watched me for a very long time. That sentence was the moment my patience died. The door clicked shut on my past. I did not panic when I saw my empty server racks, because the foundation of my defense had been poured 9 months earlier. Long before Jevon and Cynthia decided to steal my eco-resort blueprint, I knew I needed an impenetrable shield for my intellectual property. The $45 million project was too massive to finance locally without alerting the Chicago real estate syndicate, which Jevon practically controlled. If I sought funding in my own city, he would have found out and sabotaged my credit lines before I ever drafted the first floor plan. So I looked across the ocean, I packed a single carry-on bag, kissed David and Theo goodbye, and took a red-eye flight to London. I had secured a 30-minute introductory meeting with Fiona. Fiona was a 60-year-old British angel investor, known for her razor-sharp instincts and her absolute intolerance for corporate bullying. She operated a global venture capital firm specializing in sustainable infrastructure. More importantly, she was intimately familiar with Jevon's business practices. 10 years ago, Jevon had tried to aggressively push her out of a commercial development in New York. She had never forgotten his sheer arrogance. I sat in her elegant glass-walled office overlooking the Thames and presented my preliminary vision. I did not ask for a handout. I showed her a mathematically flawless path to redefining luxury ecotourism. Fiona listened in absolute silence, her sharp eyes studying my face. When I finished, she closed the portfolio. She told me my design was brilliant, but she also warned me that my parents would try to crush me the moment they realized I was becoming a threat to their outdated, concrete-heavy legacy. Fiona agreed to back the project entirely, securing the $45 million funding in a blind trust. However, she had one non-negotiable condition. She demanded proof that I could operate completely independently, severing all emotional and financial ties to Jevon and Cynthia. I had to prove I could protect my own assets against their inevitable hostility. I promised her I would. I flew back to Chicago and spent the next several months quietly building a digital fortress. Standing in my empty studio now, I did not feel defeated. I reached into the hidden lining of my leather tote bag. My fingers brushed against smooth, cold metal. I pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. I held the poison pill. The next morning, David and I did not go to the police station to scream about a stolen server. Instead, we walked into the pristine, quiet office of Vivian, one of the most ruthless and highly respected child advocacy lawyers in the state of Illinois. Jevon and Cynthia wanted a chaotic family dispute. They wanted me to show up at their corporate headquarters yelling about stolen computers, which would only feed their narrative that I was suffering a mental breakdown. I refused to give them the performance they desired. Vivian reviewed the emergency custody petition with the detached precision of a surgeon. She noted every exaggerated claim about Theo's health and every fabricated accusation regarding my mental state. She did not express outrage. She simply handed me a legal notepad and told me to start gathering the only thing that mattered in a courtroom: documentation. For the next 4 hours, we built an impenetrable wall of paper. We obtained Theo's complete pediatric history, directly certified by the chief of pediatrics at the local children's hospital. The records unequivocally proved that his mild asthma was impeccably managed and that he was in the 99th percentile for physical development. We printed out years of consistent school attendance records, glowing teacher evaluations, and logs from his extracurricular activities. Then Vivian drafted a preemptive restraining order to be filed with the school district. It explicitly barred Jevin and Cynthia from approaching the campus, citing their history of unauthorized surveillance and emotional manipulation. It was a cold, systematic dismantling of their entire character assassination. We were not fighting a dramatic battle of he said, she said. We were burying their lies under a mountain of undeniable, verifiable facts. As Vivian cross-referenced the final page of their fake custody petition, she tapped her silver pen against a specific paragraph. She pointed to a sworn affidavit attached to the back of the file. It was a formal psychological evaluation recommending that Theo be removed from my care immediately due to my supposed emotional instability. The letterhead belonged to a highly expensive boutique therapy clinic downtown. Vivian looked at the signature, then looked up at me with a sharp, calculating smile. There was a massive, fatal flaw in their meticulously forged document. The psychologist who had signed his name to the evaluation diagnosing me with severe erratic behavior had made a critical error. He never met me. While Vivian secured the legal perimeter around my son, I needed to secure the digital perimeter around my life. I contacted Nadia, an independent cybersecurity expert who specialized in corporate espionage and data forensics. I did not ask her to hack into Jevin's company. I merely asked her to trace the footprints they had carelessly left in mine. Nadia set up her equipment on our dining room table. Within 2 hours, her dual monitors were pulling lines of encrypted data from our home network history. She discovered exactly how Jevin and Cynthia had orchestrated their silent invasion. It was far more insidious than simply buying my office building and changing the locks. Nadia found traces of highly sophisticated commercial spyware. Cynthia had not just stood outside the school fence to watch Theo. She had used a private investigator to bribe a junior maintenance worker at the school, gaining temporary access to the playground's security feed. They had been monitoring his recess times, cataloging his movements to build their fake timeline of neglect. Furthermore, Nadia uncovered the digital paper trail regarding my studio eviction. The so-called safety violations that justified the immediate seizure of my property were entirely fabricated. Jevin had wired a substantial sum to an offshore account belonging to the building manager. The manager then generated a fraudulent electrical hazard report, providing Jevin's security team with the legal pretext to break my door and remove my servers under the guise of safety protocols. They had weaponized money to bypass the law. The sheer arrogance of their methods made my stomach turn, but the anger was quickly replaced by a cold, sharp focus. Nadia continued to monitor the active ping coming from the servers they had stolen. She watched in real time as Jevin's IT department desperately tried to bypass the outer security walls of my master files. They were using brute force decryption tools, assuming that my architectural drawings were protected by standard commercial software. They had no idea that they were knocking on the door of an empty vault, while the real treasure was rigged with a silent alarm. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday night, Nadia sent me a line of code. The beast took the bait. To understand the magnitude of the trap Jevin had just walked into, you have to understand how high-level architectural intellectual property is protected in the modern era. When you are designing a $45 million infrastructure project, you do not simply save a file on a hard drive and hope for the best. You build a mechanism of self-preservation. I utilized a strategy known in the tech sector as a poison pill. The master computer files Jevin had stolen were not standard architectural drafts. They were embedded with a blockchain-based smart contract and deep-layer metadata. A smart contract is a self-executing line of code. When I originally set up my servers, I programmed the primary eco-resort file to require an active encrypted authorization key from my personal device every 24 hours. Because Jevin's team had physically severed my machines from my network and forced their way into the directories, they triggered a hidden protocol. The moment they bypassed the fake outer firewall and opened the spectacular three-dimensional renderings, the smart contract silently activated in the background. It did not lock them out. It did not send them a warning. It deliberately allowed them to view, present, and even copy the gorgeous external visuals of the resort. However, beneath the surface, the poison pill began a 72-hour silent countdown. Once that countdown expired, the metadata embedded in every single digital brick window and support beam would automatically execute a structural integrity failure on any screen it was displayed on. The visual rendering would violently collapse, exposing intentional, fatal architectural flaws. Simultaneously, an unremovable, massive watermark would brand the presentation, proving the exact date, time, and original authorship of the design. Jevon thought he had acquired a masterpiece that would save his failing empire. He did not realize he had swallowed a digital time bomb. He was preparing to stand in front of Chicago's wealthiest investors, including Fiona, to present a stolen vision. He believed his money and his status shielded him from any consequences. He was so blinded by his own narcissism that he never stopped to wonder why I had surrendered the password so easily during our phone call. The clock was counting down. The bomb was ticking. The weekend leading up to the great investor gala was strangely peaceful. I deliberately created a bubble of absolute normalcy for Theo. We did not discuss the custody papers. We did not talk about his grandparents. Instead, David and I spent Saturday morning making blueberry pancakes, letting Theo cover the kitchen counter in powdered sugar. While Jevon was likely rehearsing his grand speech in a high-rise boardroom, I was kneeling on the floor of our garage, setting up a temporary workspace. David had brought out a folding table, a couple of desk lamps, and my backup monitors. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and fresh plotting paper. It was a far cry from the sleek, glass-walled studio I had lost, but it felt remarkably empowering. I was building my empire on a plastic folding table, surrounded by the quiet hum of my husband's laptop and the distant sound of my son playing in the yard. Meanwhile, the local business news channels were already buzzing with manufactured hype. Cynthia had clearly been feeding exclusives to the press. Articles appeared online, teasing a revolutionary new eco-resort vision from Jevon's firm, promising a design that would reshape the industry. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on public relations to build a pedestal for a statue they did not own. Sunday evening, I was sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing Vivian's final court filings, when an email notification appeared on my screen. The sender address belonged to Cynthia's personal assistant. It was a highly stylized digital invitation to the fundraising gala at the Drake Hotel. It was accompanied by a brief, passive-aggressive note from Cynthia, expressing her sorrow that my independent business had failed, but stating she would leave 2 tickets at the door just in case I wanted to come and support the family's continuing success. It was a calculated insult. She wanted me to sit in the back of the room and watch them steal my life's work. She wanted me to witness my own erasure. I stared at the elegant gold lettering on the screen, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I clicked the button to confirm 2 attendees. They invited their own executioner. On Monday afternoon, the silence in my garage studio was broken by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. The screen displayed Cynthia's private number. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, establishing the rhythm of the interaction before it even began. I tapped the speaker icon and continued drafting a secondary rendering on my tablet. "Hello, Cynthia," I said. I did not call her mother. That title implies a foundation of care, and she had forfeited that title the moment she filed a fraudulent court document against my son. "Vanessa, darling," her voice drifted through the speaker. It was sickeningly sweet, dripping with the kind of manufactured pity she used to control narratives at country club luncheons. "I heard you are working out of David's dirty garage. It breaks my heart to see you struggling like this. If you just sign the custody addendum and stop this ridiculous rebellion, Theo could be playing in a proper garden right now. We only want what is best for him." It was classic gaslighting. She was attempting to rewrite reality, framing their hostile takeover of my business and my child as an act of charity. Years ago, a call like this would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and defensive anger. I would have raised my voice. I would have tried to explain my worth. But I had finally learned that explaining yourself to a narcissist is like trying to draw blood from a stone. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the encrypted drive sitting on my desk. "Cynthia," I said, my voice completely flat and unbothered. "I appreciate the call. You should choose your dress very carefully for tomorrow night. You are going to need to look absolutely perfect." There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the line. She was waiting for me to break, to beg, or to scream. When I offered nothing but a calm directive about her wardrobe, the silence stretched into confusion. I ended the call. I did not look back. If you have ever been manipulated by your own family and longed for a moment of quiet resistance, comment, "I am ready" down below. The real war is just beginning. The night before the fundraising gala was a masterclass in coordinated silence. While Jevin and Cynthia were undoubtedly toasting to their impending $45 million victory, my small team of allies was locking the final pieces of our trap into place. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, I received a secure message from Nadia. She had been monitoring the active ping from the stolen server. Her message contained only 2 sentences. The file has been moved. It is now locally hosted on the primary projection system at the Drake Hotel. Jevin had taken the bait perfectly. He had loaded the poison pill directly into the central nervous system of his most important presentation. 10 minutes later, Vivian forwarded me a PDF of our counter-petition. It was a flawless legal document. It included the time-stamped proof of Theo's excellent medical care, the restraining order blocking Jevin and Cynthia from his school, and a formal request for a fraud investigation into their boutique psychologist. We were not just going to defend my right to be a mother. We were going to dismantle their right to be trusted. I closed my laptop and walked into our bedroom. I opened my closet and bypassed the soft, accommodating dresses Cynthia had always forced me to wear. I pulled out a sharp, tailored black suit. It was the armor of an independent architect. The ghost of the weak, compliant daughter they thought they had cornered was completely gone. I stood in front of the mirror, studying the calm certainty in my own eyes. I was ready. Just before midnight, there was a soft knock at our front door. David went to answer it and returned, holding a sleek international courier envelope. The return address was a corporate office in London. I opened the seal. Inside was a heavy silver lapel pin, shaped like a compass, alongside a handwritten note from Fiona. The note was brief. I will see you at the front row. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel smelled of expensive champagne, rare orchids, and desperate money. Tuesday evening had arrived, and the room was packed with Chicago's most elite venture capitalists and real estate moguls. Jevin and Cynthia had spared no expense. They had rented the largest space, setting up a massive high-definition LED screen at the front of the room to showcase the eco-resort. David and I arrived exactly 20 minutes after the opening reception began. I wore my tailored black suit. I wore the silver compass pin Fiona had sent me. As we approached the gilded double doors of the ballroom, 2 large private security guards in dark suits stepped into our path. Jevin had obviously left strict instructions at the door. The taller guard held up a hand, his expression rigid. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "You are not on the approved guest list. I have been instructed to ask you to leave the premises immediately." Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a crisp, distinctly British voice cut through the ambient noise of the hallway. "Do not be absurd," the voice commanded. Fiona stepped out from the shadows of the coat check area. She was dressed in an impeccable emerald gown, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. The security guards immediately recognized her. She was the guest of honor, the sole provider of the $45 million capital they were all here to celebrate. "They are with me," Fiona said, not breaking her stride as she walked past the guards. "If they do not enter my checkbook, leaves with them." The guards immediately stepped aside, lowering their eyes. We walked through the double doors and entered the ballroom. Across the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering jewelry, my eyes locked directly onto Cynthia. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, smiling perfectly for a photographer. When she saw me walking in alongside Fiona, the color completely drained from her face. Her perfect manicured smile froze into a mask of pure panic. The game had officially changed. I did not march to the front of the room. I did not cause a disruption. David and I quietly took our seats in the second row, directly behind Fiona's reserved armchair. I wanted Jevin to feel confident. I wanted him to climb as high as possible before the ladder was kicked out from under him. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the wealthy crowd. Jevin strode up to the mahogany podium. He looked incredibly proud, practically vibrating with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He tapped the microphone and began his speech. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about the future of green architecture and his firm's deep, unwavering commitment to environmental sustainability. It was nauseating. This was a man who had built his wealth paving over wetlands, suddenly rebranding himself as an eco-pioneer. Then he pressed a button on his remote. The massive LED screen behind him illuminated. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The 3-dimensional rendering of my eco-resort was spectacular. It showed a sprawling glass and timber structure integrated perfectly into a lush coastal landscape. It was my heart. It was my late nights, my endless calculations, and my independent vision projected 10 feet tall. And then Jevin did the unforgivable. "This design," he announced, his voice echoing through the speakers, "represents the new direction of our family empire. A legacy we are building not just for our investors, but for our grandson Theo. A safe, secure future designed by my team, ensuring our family's name remains synonymous with excellence." He was using my stolen work while simultaneously referencing the son he was legally trying to steal from me. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words was staggering. He was wrapping his theft in the warm, golden language of family devotion. I looked at David. He gave me a single affirming nod. I reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out my cell phone and unlocked the screen. I opened a custom application Nadia had built for me. It displayed a single, bright red button. Jevin leaned over the podium, locking his eyes on Fiona in the front row. He flashed his most charismatic, winning smile. "And so," he concluded, "I would like to invite our esteemed lead investor to join me on stage to formalize our partnership. $45 million to build the future together." The crowd began to applaud politely. Fiona did not stand up. She remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression entirely unreadable. I stood up. The polite applause faltered, then died away as hundreds of eyes turned toward me. I stepped out of my row and walked calmly down the center aisle. Jevin's charismatic smile vanished instantly. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard, his knuckles turned white. "Security," Jevin snapped into the microphone, his voice sharp and panicked. "Please remove my daughter. She is suffering from a severe psychological episode and is not in her right mind. She is trespassing." 2 guards at the edge of the stage took a step forward. I stopped walking. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not hurl accusations about the stolen servers or the fake custody papers. I simply looked at the man who had tried to erase my existence. I pressed the red button on my phone. A sharp, high-pitched electronic beep echoed through the ballroom's surround sound system. It was the sound of a digital vault slamming shut. The 72-hour countdown of the poison pill had been manually accelerated to 0. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, crossed my arms, and looked up at the massive LED screen. The presentation was about to change. The electronic beep from the sound system was not loud, but in the sudden tense silence of the ballroom, it sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. On the massive LED screen behind the podium, the gorgeous sunlit rendering of the eco-resort began to violently glitch. First, the digital sky turned a harsh warning siren red. Then the architectural physics simulator, the very core of the poison pill I had written, executed its hidden command. The foundational pillars of the luxury complex cracked on screen. The load-bearing timber snapped. The sweeping glass windows shattered into thousands of pixelated fragments. I stood in the center aisle and watched my own masterpiece simulate a catastrophic structural failure. It was a beautiful, devastating metaphor for the family empire Jevin had built. As the digital dust settled on the screen, a massive, unremovable watermark burned itself across the ruined image. The letters were stark white against the crimson background, impossible to ignore or explain away. Dolan Intellectual Property. Unauthorized user. Property of Vanessa Studio. The collective gasp from the audience was instantaneous. Hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest investors, socialites, and real estate magnates stared at the screen and then stared at the man on the stage. The murmurs began like a low tide and quickly swelled into a wave of shocked whispers. Camera flashes from the hired press team began to pop, capturing the exact moment of Jevin's public execution. I looked at Cynthia. The mask of the elegant, charitable matriarch had completely melted away. Her jaw was slack. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, desperate to find a friendly face, someone to validate her, but everyone was physically pulling away from their table. The social isolation she feared most was happening in real time. For a woman who valued public perception above her own daughter's life, this was a fate worse than prison. Jevin gripped the podium, his knuckles stark white. He tapped the microphone, his voice cracking with uncharacteristic panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a minor technical malfunction with the presentation software. A disgruntled former employee has clearly hacked our secure network." It was a pathetic, transparent lie. He looked desperately at the front row, seeking salvation from his primary backer. But Fiona was no longer sitting. She was standing up, smoothing the skirt of her emerald gown with terrifying calmness. The true verdict was about to be delivered. The ballroom grew so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Fiona did not raise her voice. She did not need to. True power never has to shout to be heard. Jevon Fiona said, her crisp British accent cutting through the heavy air. You have always been a man of immense ambition, but I see your ethics have not evolved since our last unfortunate encounter in New York. Jevon sputtered, stepping away from the podium. Fiona, please, this is a misunderstanding. The intellectual property rights are currently under family litigation. Do not insult my intelligence, Fiona interrupted her tone, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. I do not invest $45 million into stolen goods. I do not partner with corporate thieves. And I certainly do not do business with men who use the legal system to terrorize their own children for profit. Cynthia practically lunged forward, her hands outstretched in a desperate bid for damage control. Fiona, darling, she pleaded, her voice shaking. You do not understand Vanessa's mental state. She is unwell. We are just trying to protect our grandson. Fiona turned her icy gaze to my mother. Stop speaking, she commanded. The sheer authority in those two words made Cynthia physically recoil as if she had been slapped. Fiona turned back to the crowd. This memorandum of understanding is officially void. Furthermore, my legal team will be filing a formal complaint regarding attempted corporate fraud by this firm. The magnificent design you saw tonight belongs entirely to Vanessa Studio, and she is the only person in this room I will be signing a check for. With that, Fiona picked up her clutch purse and walked gracefully down the center aisle, stopping briefly right beside me. She offered me a small, knowing smile, completely ignoring my parents on the stage. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Investors began pulling out their phones, urgently calling their wealth managers to dump Jevon's company's stock before the market opened the next morning. Have you ever felt the profound satisfaction of watching a toxic person's mask finally slip in public? If you have, comment, "The mask fell below." But do not celebrate just yet, because a cornered beast is the most dangerous kind. The gala dissolved into a mass exodus. David and I did not stay to watch the caterers pack up the untouched food. We exited the ballroom and walked down the long, gilded corridor toward the hotel lobby. I felt lighter than I had in 33 years. The heavy, invisible chain that had tethered my self-worth to my parents' approval had been cleanly severed. But Jevon was not finished. Before we could reach the revolving doors, heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor behind us. Vanessa, stop exactly where you are. I turned around slowly. Jevon was marching toward us, his face flushed with a furious, ugly purple hue. The polished, charismatic developer was gone. He looked unhinged. Beside him was his high-priced corporate litigator, a man in a bespoke suit carrying a leather briefcase. Cynthia trailed behind them, weeping real tears for the first time in her life, mourning the death of her social standing. You think you are clever, Jevon hissed, stopping a few feet away. He was breathing heavily, invading my personal space. You think you can humiliate me in front of my peers and steal my funding? I will bury you. I will fast-track the custody petition tomorrow morning. I will tell the judge you orchestrated a cyber attack in a manic fit of rage. You will never see Theo again. David stepped forward, placing himself between me and my father. Back away from my wife, David said, his voice dangerously low. Jevon ignored him, his eyes locked on me with pure malice. You do not own that design, Vanessa. You never did. Tell her counselor. The corporate litigator stepped forward, opening his briefcase with practiced precision. He did not look at me with anger. He looked at me with the cold confidence of a man who destroys lives for an hourly billing rate. He pulled out a single sheet of paper heavily stamped and notarized. The illusion of my victory was about to be challenged. Miss Turner, the lawyer, began his tone patronizingly smooth. Regardless of your little digital stunt in the ballroom, the law is entirely blind to your dramatic flair. He held up the document. This is your original consultancy agreement from 2 years ago, when you occasionally utilized your father's corporate office space to draft your independent projects. Under Illinois corporate law, and specifically the doctrine of implied employment and the work-for-hire clauses, any intellectual property generated using company resources, networks, or hardware belongs to the firm. He let the legal threat hang in the air like a guillotine. Because you stored those master files on servers owned by my client, the lawyer continued, the eco-resort design is legally the property of his firm. By embedding a destructive code into those files, you did not protect your property. You committed corporate sabotage. You destroyed a $45 million asset belonging to your father. Jevons smiled. It was a vicious, triumphant smirk. He thought he had found the ultimate loophole. He thought his money had bought him a reality where he was the victim and I was the criminal. "We are not just taking your son, Vanessa," Jevons said softly. "We are pressing felony charges. You are going to prison." For a fraction of a second, the corridor was completely silent. The threat was terrifying. To any normal person, the mention of felony charges and corporate sabotage would induce absolute panic. They expected me to crumble, to cry, to offer them the clean, decrypted files in exchange for my freedom. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I looked at the highly paid lawyer, then looked at my father. I felt an overwhelming sense of pity for their ignorance. I turned my head slightly to the left. Vivian, my child advocacy and intellectual property lawyer, stepped out from the alcove near the coat check. She had been waiting exactly where we planned. Vivian smiled, adjusting her glasses. It was a beautiful thing to witness. "You must be exhausted," Counselor Vivian said to Jevons' lawyer, "because your due diligence is embarrassingly sloppy." Vivian walked toward us, her heels clicking methodically against the marble floor. She did not raise her voice. She opened her own slim leather folder and pulled out a stack of documents. They did not look like standard legal contracts. They were dense pages filled with alphanumeric codes and cryptographic hash functions. "I am well aware of the work-for-hire doctrine," Vivian said, handing the top page directly to Jevons' lawyer. "But to claim ownership, you have to prove the digital asset was actually created on your client's hardware." The lawyer frowned, scanning the page. "What is this?" "It is an immutable blockchain ledger," Vivian replied smoothly. "My client is not just a brilliant architect. She is exceptionally diligent. Every single stroke, every rendering, and every calculation in that eco-resort file was saved directly to a decentralized encrypted cloud network." Vivian pointed a manicured finger at a specific line of code. Notice the cryptographic timestamps. The foundational code for the eco-resort was generated 3 weeks after Vanessa permanently vacated your client's office space. Furthermore, the IP addresses logged on every subsequent edit belong exclusively to her home network and her independent studio network. Jevons' lawyer stopped reading. His confident posture began to physically deflate. "She did not store her master files on your client's servers," Vivian continued, twisting the knife with absolute professionalism. "She stored a decoy, a mirror file containing the poison pill. Your client sent a team to illegally evict her, stole a piece of hardware, and voluntarily downloaded a self-destructing file onto his own presentation network. Vanessa did not sabotage your company. You sabotaged yourselves." The corporate litigator was not a fool. He looked at the blockchain timestamp, recognized it as mathematically indisputable proof, and realized he had been handed a radioactive case. He knew that pushing a false ownership claim against cryptographic evidence would risk his own license to practice law. He closed his briefcase with a sharp snap. He turned to Jevon. "Mr. Turner, I cannot represent you in this matter. I strongly advise you to drop the custody petition immediately before the fraud division opens an inquiry into your actions." He walked away, leaving Jevon and Cynthia standing alone in the hallway. The fortress of money and lies they had spent a lifetime building had just been reduced to ash by a few lines of code. The corporate lawyer's brisk footsteps faded down the long, gilded corridor of the Drake Hotel. Jevon and Cynthia were left standing completely alone, stripped of their legal shield and their public dignity. The silence between us was absolute. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out the thick envelope containing the fraudulent custody petition Cynthia had filed against me. I stepped forward and placed it flat on a small marble console table near the wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology, because an apology from a narcissist is just another manipulation tactic. I looked at my father, who was staring at the floor, and then at my mother, whose face was streaked with ruined mascara. "Before we leave," I said, my voice as level as a ledger sheet, "you should know that Nadia has already forwarded the audio recording of your offshore transaction to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The local police department has also received the evidence regarding the school surveillance and the bribed property manager. You spent your entire lives trying to control my narrative. Tonight I wrote the final chapter." Cynthia opened her mouth, perhaps, to deploy one last, desperate attempt at maternal guilt, but the words died in her throat. She finally understood that the currency she used to buy my compliance was completely worthless. "My home, my son, and my intellect," I told them, enunciating every single syllable with absolute clarity. From this moment forward, neither of you has the right to touch any of it." I turned my back on the people who had brought me into the world. David took my hand, his grip warm and steady. We walked toward the revolving glass doors of the hotel lobby, stepping out into the cool, crisp Chicago night air. We did not look back. 30 days later, Jevon's name vanished. The fallout was swift, brutal, and highly public. By Wednesday morning, the financial news networks were running continuous segments on the dramatic collapse of the eco-resort deal. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately opened a formal, aggressive inquiry into the bribery allegations and the fraudulent safety violations at my former studio building. The stock value of Jevon's real estate empire went into an absolute freefall. Lenders began issuing immediate margin calls, freezing their corporate credit lines. The pristine, untouchable image they had spent 40 years cultivating was completely dismantled in less than 48 hours. Meanwhile, the legal battle over my son ended before it even truly began. Vivian presented the cryptographic timestamps and the certified medical records to the family court judge during the preliminary hearing. The judge was so appalled by the blatant forgery and the weaponization of the judicial system that he dismissed the custody petition with extreme prejudice. But Vivian did not stop there. She successfully secured a permanent ironclad restraining order. Jevon and Cynthia were legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Theo, our home, or my new place of business. If they even attempted to send a proxy to observe him at recess, they would face immediate criminal arrest. The fortress of lies they had built to trap me had become the very prison that locked them out of society. They were forced to sell their primary estate to cover the mounting legal fees and civil penalties. The empire had officially crumbled to dust. As I sat in my kitchen reviewing the final court documents validating my absolute freedom, my cell phone vibrated on the marble counter. A final text message had arrived. I picked up the phone. The message was from Cynthia. Even after losing her business, her reputation, and her legal battles, she could not resist attempting one last play for emotional supremacy. The message was a long, desperate paragraph. She played the victim with masterful precision. She wrote that families do not do this to one another, that I was breaking her heart, and that everything she and Jevon had ever done was simply to ensure a stable future for us. She ended the text by demanding that I call her to fix this terrible misunderstanding. In the past, a message exactly like that would have kept me awake for a week. I would have experienced a physical panic response. I would have drafted a dozen angry, defensive replies, trying in vain to make her see the truth of her own cruelty. Now, reading her words, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering guilt. I only felt a profound, peaceful exhaustion with her endless, predictable performance. I had finally learned the most powerful defense against a toxic parent. Total, impenetrable silence. I did not block her number immediately because I wanted to document any further violations of the restraining order. Instead, I tapped on her contact profile. I deleted the word mother. I replaced it with a single, highly accurate term, stranger. I deleted the text thread without typing a single letter in response. I set the phone face down on the kitchen island and walked away. Through the open window, Theo was laughing. Healing is not a singular dramatic explosion. It is a slow, deliberate construction process built upon a series of quiet, beautiful mornings. 6 months after the gala, I opened my new architectural studio. I did not choose another small, hidden room. I leased the top floor of a historic downtown building. The space was magnificent, featuring soaring ceilings, exposed brick, and massive skylights that flooded the drafting tables with natural golden sunlight. It was the exact opposite of the dark, windowless garage where I had plotted my survival. Fiona flew in from London to personally attend the grand opening. We stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city skyline and formally signed the $45 million development contract. There were no hidden clauses. There were no manipulative strings attached. It was a partnership based entirely on mutual respect and professional brilliance. In the corner of the bright studio, Theo was sitting comfortably on a massive plush rug. He was surrounded by dozens of wooden architectural blocks, humming happily to himself as he constructed a towering, gravity-defying castle. Nobody hovered over him to criticize the way his shirt was tucked in. Nobody demanded that he stand up and smile politely for a photographer. He was simply a 7-year-old boy breathing, easily existing in a space where he was completely and unconditionally loved. The air in the room felt entirely free of pressure. The chime of the glass elevator doors echoed across the studio. I welcomed a special guest. My cousin Tess stepped out of the elevator. Tess had grown up under the exact same crushing expectations that I had constantly compared to the impossible toxic standards set by Jevin and Cynthia. When the scandal surrounding the stolen eco-resort files broke on the local news, the rest of the extended family chose to remain neutral, prioritizing their social comfort over the truth. Tess was the only member of the family who refused to be quiet. She had publicly defended me, severing her own ties with the real estate. She walked across the sunlit studio holding a small, beautifully potted olive tree as a housewarming gift. I met her halfway, and we embraced. For the very first time in my life, a hug from a relative did not feel like a trap or a contractual obligation. It felt like safety. Sitting with Tess and David that afternoon, I realized a profound truth. Blood does not automatically define your family. Biology simply dictates your origins. True family consists exclusively of the people who respect your boundaries, celebrate your independence, and actively support your growth without demanding a psychological toll in return. I placed the potted olive tree on the corner of my large drafting desk. It was a symbol of peace, deeply rooted and resilient. I set a silver frame beside it. I looked at the photograph inside the silver frame. It was a candid picture of David, Theo, and myself, taken on a random Tuesday morning while we were eating blueberry pancakes. We looked messy, uncoordinated, and radiantly happy. Sometimes when the studio is quiet, I still feel a brief, sharp ache in my chest when I think about my childhood. It is a very specific kind of grief. I am not mourning the loss of Jevin and Cynthia. I am mourning the loving, supportive parents I deserved but never actually had. But as an architect, I deeply understand the nature of structures. When a foundation is fundamentally flawed, when the concrete is poured with toxic, corrosive materials, you cannot simply paint over the cracks. You cannot repair structural rot with polite compromises or temporary patches. The building will eventually collapse and crush everyone inside. To survive, you have to tear the entire structure down to the absolute bedrock. You have to clear away the debris of their expectations, their manipulation, and their guilt. The demolition of my relationship with my parents was a devastating, terrifying process, but it was the only way to clear the ground. I removed the rot. I laid a new, unbreakable foundation for my son. I picked up my drafting pen. Before I left the studio that evening, I paused in the private hallway leading to my office. Hanging on the pristine white wall was a small, custom-made frame. Inside the glass was not an award or a press clipping. It was the original eviction notice Jevin had pasted on my old door alongside the white envelope bearing Cynthia's handwriting. Do not make a scene. I did not hang it there as a symbol of trauma. I hung it as a permanent monument to my own liberation. Those words no longer hold any power over my mind. They simply mark the exact, precise moment when my lifelong obedience finally ended. True legacy is not the wealth or the expectations you inherit from toxic hands. It is the boundaries you build to protect the peace you have earned. If my journey resonated with your own struggles, or if you have ever had to build a wall to protect your peace, share this story. Your freedom might just inspire someone else's. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of surviving and thriving. Until next time.